peace science. It's a science of peace and politics. It's also science of fundamental interactions of humans. Major milestones in science. First, classical physics is a model or approximate description of fundamental interactions of nature. Quantum physics, it is a theory or exact description of fundamental interactions of nature. Peace science, that's the main topic of this presentation. It's a description of fundamental interactions of humans, first time. So the very first paper was published 2000, 24 years ago. The PAKDD conference, it was in the name of association rules. Now it's clear it's a peace rule. The very first book published, February 4, 2022, right before Ukraine war started. Now, peace science. It's science. It is a scientific description of human interaction. That's why I say the first one, right? Means there is no science previously that describe human interactions. So meet scientific standards for science. Now it's a theory of beliefs that differs from description of fundamental interactions of nature. Why is that? Because there you only need to worry about one belief, scientific belief. Here, when it comes to description of fundamental interactions of humans, well, there are two different beliefs. One is scientific belief, that's really science. There's also political belief that require a science to differentiate those two different beliefs, because right now all sciences relate to human interactions are really political belief. They're not science. So in order to separate scientific belief from political belief, what needs to be done is validation. So belief validation. That's the process called model validation. It's a process to determine if a belief is scientific or political. This is unique to any science of human interactions. So that model validation involves 4 steps: risk appetite, risk calculation, risk comparison, and belief acceptance. Basically determine whether it's a scientific belief or political belief. So I'm sure you all get confused right at the beginning of this, but that's going to show you in this presentation. That's the key processes. So in order to understand the model validation, we introduce a few concepts. First one, model, right? So a model is scientific belief, but there are 3 different beliefs of the same concept. In layman belief, it's approximation. So approximation is something that everyone can understand. In business belief, it's called control. The next one, model risk. What it is in scientific belief, it's called model risk. But in layman belief, it's simply just error of approximation. So easy to understand. In business belief, it's residual risk. Now, model validation. It's very important. Key process. What is it? Well, basically, in layman belief, it's just validation of approximation. So for a given approximation, how do you determine it's a good approximation or not? Well, you validate error of approximation based on the error of approximation to determine if that approximation is good or not. That process in business belief is control validation. In scientific belief is model validation. Now there's a special situation when approximation error is 0, then the approximation becomes exact. In scientific belief, it's called theory or rule. When model risk is 0. Peace rule is a key concept and also key topic within peace science. What it is among other functions, the key function is used for model validation. It's to validate belief. So let's take a look at model validation. So there are 4 steps involved in the process for model validation. First one, the risk appetite. What it is basically to set maximum approximation error acceptable for a good or effective approximation. Then, second step is risk calculation to calculate the risk or approximation error. Third step is risk comparison, compare risk with risk appetite. Basically compare the calculate approximation error with the maximum approximate error acceptable for a given effective approximation. Then final step is to determine if approximation is acceptable based on error of approximation for acceptable approximation. So basically it's a risk no more than risk appetite. Now, for Peace rule, it provides a formula for model validation or belief model validation. Again, 4 steps. First, risk appetite, which determines maximum risk of a political belief acceptable for approximation of scientific belief. So key understanding here is in layman language, right? Approximation is a scientific belief, and approximation error is a political belief. You set the maximum error acceptable for the approximation of scientific belief. Then the risk calculation, you calculate the risk of political belief. That's the key. You use Peace rule, which provide formula to calculate the risk of political belief. Then for risk comparison, you compare risk with risk appetite based on comparison to determine whether it's a scientific belief or political belief. If the risk of political belief acceptable for scientific belief, then accept the scientific belief. Again, risk is no more than risk appetite. Now, come back to the core of peace science. 3 lines of defense that summarize everything in peace science. What does it mean is it's really peace science, there are only 3 lines for pretty much the entire peace science. That's reason number one, use 3 lines of defense. Reason number two, that's familiar terminology in email or anti-money laundering space. If you ask anybody in email space, 3 lines of defense should be able to tell you what are 3 lines of defense, what are the first line, second line, third line. So similarly, we use that. That basically describe peace science in one angle. So question is what to defend? Well, in email space, to defend financial systems against money laundering. In science, it's really to defend science against politics laundering. Now, peace science as 3 lines of defense can be applied to pretty much everything in the world. Here are examples. Peace, politics, peace rule. 3 lines. What it does is to determine what is peace, what is politics. Second, scientific belief, political belief, belief rule. Going through the model validation to determine what belief is scientific belief, what belief is political belief. Then multipolar belief and unipolar belief to determine separate multipolar belief from unipolar belief. And also to separate multipolar world from unipolar world and multipolar world order from unipolar world order. Now, fundamental interactions of nature. Why do we do that? Well, let's take a look at the description fundamental interactions of nature and see what similarity. Use same terminology, 3 lines of defense. So it's to defend or separate atom from ion. The first one, atom, it's a bound state defined as an electrically neutral coexistence of electrically charged subatomic particles. Second, ion is defined as an electrically charged coexistence of electrically charged subatomic particles. Third, we use atom rule. What is it, right? It's a sum of electric charges of all subatomic particles in a given bound state. So it's a validation of model of atom. Same 4 steps for model validation. The risk appetite, which set maximum risk of ion acceptable for atom, which is 0. Risk calculation, calculate the risk of ion by sum of electric charges of all particles in a given bound state. Third, risk comparison, compare the risk with risk appetite. And then last step, to determine if a bound state is atom, if the risk of ion acceptable for atom, which is 0. So give you the idea, very similar description can be done in a description of fundamental interactions of nature. Now come back to peace science, 3 lines of defense, the most important concepts, peace and politics. Basically defend peace against politics. First line, define peace. Peace is politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs. Second line, politics, which is a politically charged coexistence of political beliefs. Then third line is a peace rule for model validation, for the model of peace and politics, going through the same 4-step model validation, risk appetite, set maximum risk of politics, acceptable for peace. Peace in this case is approximation, politics is error. Then use peace rule to calculate risk of politics, compare risk with risk appetite, and determine if there is indeed peace, if the risk of politics is acceptable for peace. Otherwise, it's politics. BRI, it is another angle or description of peace science. What it is, it's a belief, rule, initiative. Belief because it's just one belief and one rule. Initiative is really a new start for science, or at least new start of new age of science. So first, scientific belief. It's also non-political belief, multipolar belief. They're largely pretty much the same, although there's subtle difference. Scientific belief is more additional scientific standards need to be met. But in most of cases, pretty much covers non-political and multipolar. Basically, if any belief is scientific, it has to be non-political. It has to be multipolar, right? So that's the first belief. Well, it's the belief of this science. Okay, it's a scientific belief of everything represented by X. What does it mean? Everything means X means every concept, every topic, such as science, peace, politics, multipolarity, unipolarity, international relations, economics, and so on. Defined as a political neutral coexistence of political beliefs of everything, X. Then, second, the political belief defined as a politically charged coexistence of political beliefs of everything, or X. Third line is again peace rule that used for validation of belief model. Same 4 steps. Risk appetite, set the max risk of political belief acceptable for a scientific belief, right? And then calculate risk of political belief, compare risk with risk appetite, finally determine a given belief whether it's acceptable for scientific belief if the risk of political belief acceptable for scientific belief. Now, the next application of peace science is 3 lines of defense for science. Science is extremely important concept as well as topic. Again, the same 3 lines. First one, scientific belief of science. It's a politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs of science. Correspondingly, political belief of science is a politically charged coexistence of political beliefs of science. Now, it's too abstract, of course, for everyone. So let's take a look at, for example, what's more specific definition of science? For example, it is one expression is a scientific description of everything. That's what science supposed to be, although I'm sure it's no such a description anywhere online be found. But that's why most of those, if not all, really a political belief of science. So all of those definitions online, yes. So the keywords for science here to be scientific belief is scientific description is objective description of what science does. It does everything, but also the scope is everything. And the scientific really here means meeting scientific standards. There are several core scientific standards must be met in order to be science or scientific study. Otherwise, something else. Most important one is political independence. I'm sure that's not described anywhere, but that's the most important scientific standard to determine any given study, any given description, whether it's scientific or not. This is very, very important. Some other scientific standards are known. For example, has to be objective description or study. And what does mean is objective is quantity. That's qualification for objective. But anyway, so that's give you what looks like for a scientific belief of a description of science. Right? Here's the description, very compact, but it's precise. Now, give you an example of political belief of science. First, definition of science. You can find all different definitions online, but all of them, what I call political belief, well, not me, but peace science is science to tell whether it's a political belief. All of them, political belief of science. For different reasons, we can have a different discussion and videos to get into that. But for now, the claim is all online definition and descriptions of science are subjective. And therefore, it's political belief. Now, examples of science that are political belief of science: political science, international relations, economics, social sciences, the government study. All of them are not science. I mean, not scientific belief of science, because they all fail to meet scientific standards for science, for scientific study. None of them meet that one. Even though one might argue maybe economics, because the difference between economics and other ones is that economics does have objective description of economic activities, right? But that's not good enough, because the underlying interactions are political interactions of humans. In other words, all economic activities are driven by fundamental interactions of humans, which is political interactions of humans. Unless you have objective description, fundamental interactions of humans, you don't have science. You don't have scientific belief of economics. That's why peace science is trying to determine which one is, right? So that's part of the study in peace science, to provide scientific belief of economics, real science in economics. All right. Third line, Peace rule. Again, for model validation, in this case, it's the model of science, right? For any given science, claimed to be science, you go through, basically use Peace rule, go through the same model validation. In the end, you can determine whether that's a scientific belief of science or political belief of science, right? Again, it's a first step, risk appetite. Let's say the maximum risk of political belief of science acceptable for a scientific belief of science as approximation. Then risk calculation to calculate risk of political belief of science. Compare that risk with risk appetite. The final step, determine if a given science is acceptable for scientific belief of science if the risk of political belief of science is acceptable for scientific belief of science. The next application of peace science, 3 lines of defense for standards. Standards play extremely important role because it is scientific standards, non-political standards, that determine what is science, what is political belief science, what is peace, what is political belief of peace, what is politics, what is political belief of politics, for every single concept, every single topic. This is why peace science is science for everything. Okay, again, same 3 lines. First one, scientific belief of standards. That's a politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs of standards. Then second, political belief of standards. It's a politically charged coexistence of political beliefs of standards. Now, scientific belief of standard is scientific standard and non-political standard and multipolar standard. On the other hand, double standards and unipolar standards are political belief of standards. Yeah, we'll talk about what's unipolar standard, right? It's a political standard, but in the name of non-political standard. A double standard is you have both scientific standard and political standard. How it's applied depends on politics. Scientific standard applied when there is no politics. Political standard applied when there is politics. This is a separate topic, but the point is that can be described objectively in science, right? It's not subjective description in any political belief. But anyway, third one, peace rule. It's validation of model of standard to determine any given standard, whether it's a scientific standard or non-political standard, a multipolar standard, or political standard. Going through the same 4 steps for the standard model validation. From setting the risk appetite, maximum risk of political belief of standard acceptable for scientific belief of standard. Use peace rule to calculate risk of political belief of standard. Then compare the risk with risk appetite. Final step, determine a given standard, whether it's a scientific standard or political standard. It is scientific standard if the risk of political belief of standard acceptable for scientific belief of standard. So again, the scientific standards play extremely important role on determining everything or anything, whether it's a scientific, non-political, multipolar, or political. Now, next, it's a peace. Going back to the core concept of peace sense. 3 lines. The first one, scientific belief of peace, which is defined by a politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs of peace. Second, political belief of peace is a political coexistence of political beliefs of peace. It's very abstract, right? So we'll take a look at some examples. For scientific belief of peace, it's really about political neutral coexistence relationship that can be found everywhere. So it can be between individuals. Two individuals, the relationship is independent of political belief, but also can be at the group level, social groups, and more importantly, at the country level. The relationship between two countries is defined as peace or political neutral if that relationship is independent of political beliefs. On the other hand, example of definition of peace is, for example, military conflict. That's one definition, right? Well, at least it's used in some definition. There are other definitions of peace you can find, but all of them are subjective definitions of peace. Because subjective, so it's a political belief of peace. Can going through the same rigorous model validation to determine the political characteristic of any given description or definition of peace. Right? The same validation process to validate peace model. Risk appetite to set max risk of political belief of peace acceptable for scientific belief of peace. And then calculate risk, compare risk with risk appetite, finally determine a given description or definition of peace, whether it's a political belief or scientific belief. It is scientific belief if the risk of political belief of peace acceptable for scientific belief of peace. It's important. It has to be scientific belief to be non-political belief of peace from any given description or definition of peace. So basically, in peace science, that's key description of peace, meeting all scientific standards for scientific belief of peace. And everything else you can check online. Every single description, definition of peace is a political belief because it's all subjective. Now, politics. Same 3 lines. Scientific belief of politics. We gave objective description, a politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs of politics. On the other hand, political belief of politics is a political coexistence of political beliefs of politics. For example, for scientific belief, it can be defined as simple as politics is simply just difference between political beliefs. The difference really defines the level of political activity or the level of politics. The bigger difference, the more political. So that's objective description of politics. On the other hand, you can find out all different definitions online. Typical one is the government activity, which is highly subjective, because politics is really any political activity. It has nothing to do with who conduct activity, but rather it's the political characteristics of given activity to determine whether it's politics or not. On the other hand, the government activity, it clearly, subjectively tells you, well, it's a government activity, it's politics. It's a subjective, it's political belief. There are other different variations you can find for definition of politics online, all of them subjective definitions, meaning they are all political belief of politics. You can go through the same model validation process for the model of politics, right, provided by Peace Rule, to eventually go through 4 steps, determine any given definition or description of politics, whether it's a scientific belief or political belief, right? Again, risk appetite, set max risk of political belief of politics acceptable for scientific belief of politics. Then you calculate risk using Peace Rule, calculate the risk of political belief of politics, and compare risk with risk appetite, then determine any given description of politics, whether it's a scientific belief or political belief. It's a scientific belief if the risk of political belief of politics acceptable for scientific belief of politics. The next one is multipolarity. So applied same 3 lines to multipolarity. The first one is scientific belief of multipolarity, defined as politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs of multipolarity. Then political belief of multipolarity, defined as a political coexistence of political beliefs of multipolarity. Now, for scientific belief multipolarity, the key qualification is independent of political beliefs. This is something that not very many people know. For example, it's a coexistence relationship between 2 countries as multipolar relationship if that relationship is independent of political beliefs. What does it mean, independent political beliefs, right? So 2 countries, A and B, say A has political system of liberal belief. Independent of political belief means if it changed to communist system, or vice versa, that relationship between A and B is independent of political belief, should not be impacted. Otherwise, it's not multipolar relationship. Okay? So for political belief of multipolarity, an example is there is description or definition of multipolarity out there that says basically it's a multipolar system in which you have multiple dominant powers or multiple dominant powers in international politics or international relations. Right there, that's a political belief of multipolarity because it's a subjective. Okay? Now, you can go through the same model validation process of 4 steps to validate any given description of definition of multipolarity as a model. To determine, first of all, from risk appetite, that the risk of political belief of multipolarity acceptable for scientific belief of multipolarity, and calculate the risk of political belief of multipolarity, compare the risk with risk appetite, and determine the political characteristics of a given description of multipolarity. It is multipolarity, scientific belief of multipolarity, if the risk of political belief of multipolarity is acceptable for scientific belief of multipolarity. The same logic and concept apply to unipolarity, right? 3 lines, you have scientific belief of unipolarity, defined as politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs of unipolarity. You also have political belief of unipolarity, defined as a political coexistence of political beliefs of unipolarity. Now, take a look at the example, right? So you want to see what does it mean, right? Because it's an abstract level, difficult to see what it means. Well, in short, unipolarity in scientific belief is just maximum politics. Maximum politics. Although it sounds like I gave you a subjective description. No, it's not. It is the result of objective description and validation, and determine that unipolarity represent the maximum politics. What does it mean, right? Scenario number 1, it means no coexistence of political beliefs on anything, whether it's a concept, whether it's a topic, for example, right? Democracy, very familiar one. If you do not accept there's other description from other political beliefs different from your political belief on the description of simple concept of democracy, if you reject that and believe your belief is the only belief for democracy, you reject coexistence of other political beliefs. You simply reject the existence of other political beliefs of that concept, whether it's democracy, whether it's politics, whether it's science. Right? And scenario number 2 is political belief in the name of non-political belief. That is situation, if you define something based on political belief and you let people believe that is non-political belief, but in reality it is political belief, and that's scenario number 2, unipolar belief, right? So that's unipolarity. Now, on the other hand, for political belief of unipolarity, any description that does not meet scientific standard for scientific belief of unipolarity is political belief. For example, you can find there's a description of unipolarity or unipolar system, that is a single dominant power system, right? Single country. That is subjective description of unipolarity. It's not objective description in quantity, right? So that's political belief. And to determine any given description of unipolarity to be scientific belief or political belief, going through the same model validation process to validate the model of unipolarity using Peace rule. Again, the same 4 steps. First step, risk appetite, set the maximum risk of political belief of unipolarity acceptable for a scientific belief of unipolarity. Then you calculate the risk of political belief of unipolarity, compare the risk with risk appetite, and then determine any given description of or definition of unipolarity, whether it's a political belief or scientific belief. It's a scientific belief if the risk of political belief of unipolarity is acceptable for scientific belief of unipolarity. The next topic, extremely important, international relations. It's very important for a number of reasons. I'm going to have several videos to talk about this important topic, but in this presentation, just give you some basic concepts. Again, 3 lines. The first one, scientific belief of international relations, defined as a politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs of international relations. Second, a political belief of international relations, defined as politically charged coexistence of political beliefs of international relations. Now, we look at the example, right? From scientific belief, it has to be political neutral coexistence relationship between countries of different political beliefs. This is the key. The question is, can you find it? Where did you find it, right? On the other hand, example for political belief international relations is a coexistence relationship between countries of the same political belief. That's political relationship. It's not independent political belief, because independent political belief is if you change the belief, political belief of the same country, does the relationship change? If not, then independent political belief. If it change, then it's political. This is big misunderstanding out there, right? People think, it's a peaceful relationship, non-political between certain countries under what's called the same value, whatever, right? It's the same political belief, right? It's a political belief because it's not independent of political belief. If it's changed political belief of one country, the relationship changed. Okay, this is science. So what's important for international relations finding is current international relations under the name of science is political belief. It's not science. And there is a whole lot of proof to pretty much prove everything within current international relations is political belief. But that's not end of it. It's the start, because peace science present a new scientific belief, real science for international relations. That's entirely new. Okay, so to validate any given study in international relations as a model, to determine whether it's a political belief or scientific belief for real science, well, going through the same model validation using Peace rule. Risk appetite, set the maximum risk of political belief of international relations acceptable for scientific belief of international relations. Then you use Peace rule to calculate risk of political beliefs of international relations, compare that risk with risk appetite, and determine a given international relations study, whether it's a political belief or scientific belief. It's a scientific belief if the risk of political belief of international relations acceptable for a scientific belief of international relations. Now, let's look at a little bit more detail of current international relations. As I claimed, it's entirely political belief. First, we look at what is required for scientific belief of international relations. Basically, it requires peace or politically neutral coexistence relationship among countries, independent of political beliefs. That determines what is scientific belief. It's also basically, typically, in the event of international events happen, it's the response to political events at the international level to determine whether it is a scientific belief or IR or something else. You look at it just saying political neutrality, which is most important qualification, one and only actually, qualification for peace, for scientific belief of everything or anything. And the non-political belief, you have to have political neutrality. For multipolar, you have to have political neutrality. Otherwise, it's not. Now, second, political belief of international relations, as I claim, right now, all studies in international relations are political belief. Now, pick example. Realism is very well-known belief in international relations. I call belief, they call theory. That's not, because theory is a special case of approximation when there is no error. Clearly, it's not the case. In all study of human interactions, there is no such thing as exact. So no theory. It's a model in the name of belief. But look at it further. So what it does, realism, the key logic for realism is power politics. Wow. Power politics. This is explicitly expressed for realism. Everybody knows that. Number one, right there, it's politics. There's no way, nothing that can be political neutral, that can be for peaceful relationship, right? Now it's power politics is really to gain the power. That's what unipolar is all about. Now, assumption. So there are several assumptions in realism to justify basically their response to political events, right? A key assumption is basically saying, okay, international anarchy and international relations typically more often to have an international conflict and then ultimately determined by war. Wow. First of all, that assumption, huge question there. In scientific belief, that clearly is invalid assumption. But let's ignore that validity of that assumption. It's a given. It's not in any way should be used as excuse to justify your response that is political. Okay, that's the key. That's basically what's in the realism. They talk about anarchy, conflict, war, and then they give you impression the way to respond is super political. That is political. There is no peace, no scientific element there, no multipolar element there. People need to understand that, right? Now, to look at further within realism, there is one called offensive realism. Offensive realism is more political, if not maximum political. It's basically say more political, less peace by two key concepts. First, it says increase power. What does it mean? It's increase unipolar power. Okay? And second one, decrease power. Decrease what? Decrease multipolar power. Okay? Basically make the international relations more political, more extreme, more unstable. no peace defined by scientific belief. Just ignore the definition for no military conflict. Even for no military conflict, it's for politics, not for peace. Okay? This is very important to understand. For example, there are different views regarding to Ukraine war. There is view from realism that say, no, should not have Ukraine war or should stop ceasefire. One need to understand if the rationale comes from realism. It's not for peace. Realism is basically used main logic for current political believers involved in Ukraine war. They basically have the same objective to maintain unipolar system, maintain that. The difference is what the strategy to achieve the same objective, to keep unipolar power, right? So one rationale from offensive realism is, well, because the outcome of Ukraine war is bad, actually decreased unipolar power and increased multipolar power. That's contradict to the very core belief of offensive realism. Therefore, should stop Ukraine war, right? In order to increase unipolar power and decrease multipolar power. You see, even though the argument is good for stop Ukraine war or no Ukraine war, but the root cause, the rationale is different. It still try to achieve the same objective for the Ukraine war, is to maintain unipolar power. Anyway, that's realism. And then liberalism, well, it is less political than realism, but still political, because it does consider correlation in the form of collaboration, cooperation, but still not good enough to be political neutral. Therefore, there's no peace there. So basically, if you look at all the textbook of international relations, you cannot find anything for peace, to be qualified by politically neutral coexistence relationship between countries. You can't find anywhere. So it has pretty much no element for scientific belief. It's entirely political belief, good or bad. Well, it's a political belief. Now, the next one is data science, computer science. Same three lines. Well, if I go there, people would think, wow, what are you talking about, right? Data science, it's just data. There's no politics. Well, that's what you think. And in reality, that's not the case. So, scientific belief of data. So politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs of data. And then second, political belief of data is politically neutral or politically charged coexistence of political beliefs of data. Then obviously the question, what you're talking about, political belief of data? Yeah. Well, it depends on the characteristic of underlying force, that data capture, right? So typically data is representation of two different fundamental interactions. If these fundamental interactions of nature, that's the source of data, right? Then it is represent scientific, study of data. Now, if data sourced from political interactions of humans, well, it's not the data that determine the political characteristic, it's the fundamental interactions of humans determine the political characteristic of that data, because data is just representation of underlying interactions of humans, right? And give you an example. Market basket data. Market basket analysis is very well-known analysis, and in particular, association rules comes from there. So what market basket data is typically the basket of shopping items, yeah? Bread, milk, and veggie, whatever, fruit. It does represent interactions between shoppers and store owners or supermarket owners, all right? That is interaction between humans, okay? So it is, therefore, that interactions determine political characteristics of the data, okay? Now, again, going through the same model validation process of 4 steps to validate model of data for a given set of data. Again, start with the risk appetite, maximum risk or political belief of data, acceptable for scientific belief of data. And then calculate the risk, political belief of data, compare risk with risk appetite, and finally determine the political characteristic of data, whether scientific belief or political belief. It's a scientific belief if the risk or political belief of data acceptable for scientific belief of data. Now, let's take a look at this data belief a little bit further, right? So if you look at the market basket data, what it represents, it's the relationship, coexist, or you could call co-occurrence, coexistence relationship between shopping items, correct? Between milk and bread, for example. So the key concept there is concept of coexistence belief, right? On the other hand, you also have non-coexistence belief. That is, sometimes it coexists, other time non-coexist. That is, 2 items coexist in one basket but not in another basket. How do you determine whether it's coexist or non-coexist? That's scientific belief to be able to differentiate that. That's exactly what the Peace Rule does, right? To be able to differentiate 2 distinct relationships. One is for coexistence, one is for non-coexistence. In the situation of market basket data, it's not black and white. Yes, the relationship between milk and bread is coexistence, or relationship between 2 others non-coexist. It's not black and white, because sometimes yes, sometimes no. That's what science is all about. Use risk theory to go through risk assessment. That's what the Peace Rule does, right? And then determine what's the risk for non-coexistence, for approximation of coexistence. So going through the same model validation process, right? What you do is you set risk appetite, take coexistence as approximation or model. You set the maximum risk of non-coexistence as an error, acceptable for approximation or model of coexistence. Then you use Peace Rule to calculate risk of non-coexistence, compare the risk with risk appetite. Finally, you determine scientifically if it is coexistence or non-coexistence belief, right? It is coexistence belief or model if the risk of non-coexistence is acceptable for coexistence belief. It's clear, right? That's basically the origin of peace rule. The first, when it was developed back in 2000, I look at existing models for association rules for the purpose of market basket analysis, right? And the popular model is conditional confidence. And that model and another model, chi-square test, they both failed test or model validation. Model validation failed. And then that was the reason that I figured out, develop this peace rule. Back then it was really called coexistence rule in the name of association rules, published in 2000, right? Because that one is the only one back then was able to differentiate two distinct relationships in market basket data. This co-occurring, non-co-occurring relationship, right? So, indeed, that's the origin for this whole thing of scientific belief versus political belief. Okay, so again, going back to the core, any data that come from source, from fundamental interactions of humans, and there's a difference in terms of political belief versus scientific belief. Are you able to differentiate fundamental two different relationships? If not, it's a political belief. If it is able to do that, then it's scientific belief. Okay, and that's why I'm saying that there is a great deal of opportunity to study the data that come from human interactions. Now, next one is economics. Same three lines, scientific belief of economics, okay, and that's a politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs of economics. Then second, political belief of economics. That's politically charged coexistence of political beliefs of economics. Now, that's at the abstract level. This is very important because that's my claim, right? Current economics is not science. It's because it failed to meet scientific standard of science. But more importantly, there is way presented by peace science for scientific study of economic models. Okay? Current one is political study. It's not science. There is science out there that meet scientific standards. Okay? To be specific, let's take a look at an example. Let's say what we know is one popular belief of economic model is individualism. For example, capitalist, right? Capitalism. It's a typical individualism belief of economic model. On the other hand, there is collectivism belief of economic model. Okay, complete collectivism economic model is completely all the business owned by the country, for example, the government, right? That's the other extreme. So what we're talking about for any scientific study, or for scientific belief, it should be a politically neutral coexistence of those two models, beliefs. Let's say IC model for individual and collective. It has to be a neutral model. That's something I guess I don't see anywhere, Stan, right? On the other hand, you could have a political IC model, that is political coexistence of those two beliefs. You could have that somewhere. But to be scientific belief, it has to be, that's the condition, neutral, right? Now, what I can say is the best candidate I can think of is the Chinese economic model, okay? Because this requires whole structure for an effective collectivism belief and also individualism belief, okay? It's very difficult to find any country that have both. And so there is a saying that in China over the past, by the way, it's really sad that we have, it's an experiment basically from science point of view, right there. We have experiment, very successful experiment in Chinese economic model over past 40 years, right? It's just that I don't see any scientific belief of economics or truly scientific study of that. At the best, it's political study. You could consider both elements, but it has to be in a way that meets scientific standard. Now, there's a famous saying. It's called 摸着石头过河, which translates into cross the river by touching the stones. But I don't think it's an adequate translation, but I don't have better translation. What does mean is this, because it's the same experience I had, developed the peace rule and peace science over also similar decades. And pretty much every other work that I've done, the core of my work is objectivity. That's what it means. 摸着石头过河 means really objectively, they don't know exactly what they're searching for. It's just try this, try that, and find something work, get it, find something else work, use it. That's exactly the logic for objectivity, right? You don't assume anything. You try a different thing that figure out which one work. That's precisely the recipe for my work for peace science and every other piece that I've been doing, right? But anyway, so this economics is super important topic for any future scientific study. As I claimed, so far, the current economics is the political belief of economics. It's not scientific belief, therefore it's not science. Now, for any study in economics, you can go through the same model validation process to validate the economics model and to determine the political characteristics of a given study, right? And again, the risk appetite, set the max risk of political belief of economics acceptable for scientific belief of economics, and then use peace rule or equivalent to calculate the risk political belief of economics, compare risk with risk appetite, finally determine whether you have scientific belief of economics. Yes, if the risk of political belief of economics is acceptable for scientific belief of economics. Again, I want to emphasize this is another important topic. So along with the international relations, very important, and data science, very important, and economics, 3, and then next one also very important, 4. Social science. 3 lines. Scientific belief of social science, defined by politically neutral coexistence of political beliefs of social science. Then political belief of social science is a political coexistence of political beliefs of social science. And we can use example IC model as an example to illustrate the point, right? So we're talking about for scientific belief is a the neutral coexistence of individualism belief of social model and collectivism belief of social model. right? Neutral coexistence. That's the key words for any scientific study to be scientific. Otherwise, you have political IC model. That's a political coexistence of individualism belief of social model and collectivism belief of social model. All right? And to determine any given study or description in social science, whether it's a political belief or scientific belief, going through the same validation, model validation process of 4 steps, risk appetite, set max risk of political belief of social science or social model acceptable for scientific belief of social science, and calculate risk, compare risk with risk appetite, finally determine the political characteristic of a given social study. It is scientific belief if the risk of political belief of social science is acceptable for scientific belief of social science. Thank you very much.